welcome to my channel. When I was last showing my window bloomers in early June of this year, in 2023, they looked perfectly healthy, showing off their beautiful blooms with many more flower buds to open. Few window bloomers, nothing can beat the natural light for African violets. This is the east-facing window and they do really well here. This is the first blooming cycle of AV Crimean cherry. Little did I know then that danger was already looming on the horizon. About mid-July, I realized that my window bloomers and a few other plants growing in the same area had been attacked by thrips. When I first discovered them, I got rid of the affected plants and spent several weeks treating the rest of my collection and repotting it with fresh systemic insecticide granules. Now that they're recovering, I decided to make this video in hope that this information will be helpful to fellow African violet growers. I want to cover as much information for you as possible, so to make it manageable, I divided this video into two parts. Today, in part 1, I will share how I discovered the infestation and what I learned about thrips since then. And in part 2, I will show you how I treated my plants and what I'm planning to do from this point on to keep my collection thrips-free. When I started growing African violets a few years ago, I learned about the risks of various insect infestations and the insects that affect African violets. To address these risks, I researched different insecticides available on the market and started using Bonite systemic houseplant insect control granules as preventative in my potting mix. Another precaution that I took was placing all new plants in quarantine before introducing them to main collection. I have a video showing how I process all new arrivals in my African Violet Care playlist. When I first noticed signs of thrips this summer, all of my plants growing in the affected area, including African violets and geraniums, had been quarantined upon arrival and were grown with Bonite systemic houseplant insect control granules in their potting mix. The tricky part here is that the active ingredient imidacloprid, and you can see this active ingredient here on the label, is active for only first 8 weeks. And then it starts wearing off, leaving the older potting mix and the new growth vulnerable to insects that can get in from outside. Because I don't repot all of my plants so frequently every 8 weeks, I always monitor my collection and inspect my plants regularly for infestation symptoms. And during one of those inspections in July, I was in for a surprise discovery. Before we go into symptoms though, let's talk about what thrips are and the causes of thrips infestations. Thrips are very small, about 1 to 2 millimeter long, slender insects with fringed wings. Because they're so small, they're normally invisible to human eye, and when you zoom in with your camera, you don't see the wings, but you can certainly see the actual insect, and I'll show it to you in a little bit. Thrips have existed on Earth for millions of years. The first recorded mention of thrips dates back to the 17th century. Today, there are thousands of thrips known to exist around the world, about 7,700 species. Some of the commonly known species are greenhouse thrips, those that affect houseplants, and western flower thrips. A fun fact about their name is that the word thrips has the same form in singular and plural. I see 1 thrips and I see 20 thrips. You still use the same word thrips. Thrips are dangerous not only because they cause plant damage, when feeding on blooms and foliage, but also because they serve as vectors for over 20 viruses that cause plant disease, including one of the most dangerous viruses known to the African violet community, impatiens necrotic spot virus, or INSV. I'm so glad that I've been testing my collection for INSV for the past 2 years and getting rid of the plants that tested positive in the new purchases while I kept them in quarantine, like the one shown on the previous photo. This way, I didn't have to worry that the thrips that got from outside this year would spread the INSV from one plant to another. Now let's talk about the thrips life cycle. Thrips develop through several stages. Knowing how they behave during each stage is important because it helps us, first, to identify them during each stage, and second, to manage their infestation. I found a great thrips life cycle video. I will share a link in the description box. In brief, thrips hatch from an egg and develop through 2 actively feeding larval stages, living on foliage, and it's important to know where you can find them to identify the infestation, and then 2 non-feeding stages, the prepupa and pupa, living in soil, before becoming an adult. That's why it is important to treat both the plant and the soil in which it grows when fighting thrips infestations. Some species, however, pupate not in soil, but openly on lower leaf surfaces, such as greenhouse thrips. This is why it is important to spray insecticide not only on top, but also on the underside surfaces of the leaves when treating plants for thrips. The life cycle of a thrips begins with the mother thrips laying an egg. Thrips eggs are very small, about 0.2 millimeter long, so they're not really visible to human eye. Sometimes the adult female inserts them in a slit. She makes a slit in the leaf surface and then inserts the egg there. And sometimes other species just lay the eggs on top of the leaves. Then it takes about 2 to 5 days for an egg to hatch. Once the egg hatches, thrips goes through 2 instar or larval stages, and then through the prepupal and the pupal stages. And then it turns into an adult. On average, the adult stage can be reached in about 8 to 15 days, from an egg to an adult. The growth speed is greatly influenced by temperature. Under optimum temperature conditions, which is about 80 to 85 Fahrenheit, the western flower thrips, for example, can develop in less than 10 days. The first 2 instar larvae are like small wingless adults, light in color, and visually can be confused with springtails. The difference between thrips larvae and springtails is that thrips larvae lives on foliage, whereas springtails live in the soil. Now, the tricky part here is that just like there are 1,000 species of thrips, there are also 1,000 species of springtails, and their behavior might be slightly different between different species. That's what had fooled me when I first started noticing the larvae on leaves, but not seeing any spilled pollen on the blooms, which is also a sign of thrips. When I first started noticing those in July, I thought they looked just like some of the calambula or springtail species. Various thrips species can live from 30 to 45 days. Overwintering thrips may live through the winter. Thrips can survive the winter at different life cycle stages as adults and also through egg and pupal diapause. Thrips can be detrimental to houseplant collections because they multiply in geometrical progressions, really. When thrips reach adulthood, on average it takes 8 to 15 days, as I had mentioned previously, they start laying eggs. During their lifetime, female thrips lay from 150 to 300 eggs, each hatching in about 1 week. This is why thrips infestations, if gone unnoticed, can get out of control very quickly and destroy your collection. Imagine this, just one female thrips produces 150 to 300 thrips flying around or crawling around your home. The offspring, reaching adulthood from 8 to 15 days, in turn starts laying own eggs too. This way, just one thrips can produce multiple generations per year. When I first didn't notice a few adult thrips hiding under the geranium leaf, they managed to lay eggs on my African violets, growing in the same area. Those eggs hatched and turned into larvae, and that's when I caught them in action. And before I show you what I saw, let's talk about causes of thrips infestations briefly. Thrips are a common pest. I didn't know how common they were until I started researching this topic and paying closer attention to my plants out in the garden. Now, let's go thrips hunting. Every garden that has blooming plants is very likely to have thrips among them. Beautiful gladiolus, just freshly opened. And what do we see inside of this plant? Here we see some wildlife happening. There is some kind of a bug inside the throat of this gladiolus, and then there are some smaller bugs in addition to the large visible bug. Thrips are also known to live on roses, and you can sometimes even see them on the light colored flowers. Here it's very hard to see if this particular rose bloom has thrips, but if you take a white sheet of paper and just shake the blooms by tapping them against that white sheet of paper, it is very likely that you will see some insects crawling. On the sheet of paper. Here we go. And of course, I'm not an entomologist, and I can't tell with certainty that this is a flower thrip, but it is certainly an insect that lived inside of the rose blooms. And it may very well be the flower thrips. In addition to living in open nature, thrips are also known to live in greenhouses, plant nurseries, etc. How do thrips get inside? Thrips are very opportunistic. They can get inside not only with new plants, but also through doors, windows, clothing, hair, shoes, with groceries. Yes, there are onion thrips species too, with visitors, you name it. I'm still not sure how mine got in, but somehow they managed. The bloomer's window doesn't have any rose bushes growing outside, but the one next to it here does have really tall rose plants growing very close to the window. And I had to trim them over the summer because some of the branches were very long and they were almost touching the window. So I'm wondering if the thrips crawled through the cracks that are not visible to human eye, that might exist between the window frame and the building structure, or maybe they just got in from outside in a different way. In the same area, I also have this kitchen sink window. My African violet plants loved growing here. There are no roses outside, just the Japanese maple tree, and some of the plants that you're about to see used to grow here. The main symptom is visible insects at different stages. Sometimes you can see older insects in the slower moving species like the greenhouse thrips. But if the species you're dealing with are fast movers, most likely what you will see will be the slower moving larvae. The first time I noticed something was off with my African violets growing in this area were the little white specks on leaves. In the past, I'd learned that the main symptom to watch out for when checking plants for thrips was spilled pollen on blooms. Now, my plant's blooms didn't have the spilled pollen, so I thought the white specks on leaves were just specks of dust or perlite, or maybe some springtails managed to get on leaves. I didn't make a big deal out of it at first. And then I noticed that leaves on this geranium that you see here in front of you, and what's left over of that geranium rather, started getting some scars and looking deformed. I didn't see any insects on top surface of the leaves on this plant, but when I checked the underside, that's when I saw them. These were the only adult thrips or pre-adult thrips that I had discovered, because I know that pupa in greenhouse thrips can also live on foliage rather than in soil like in other species. Because they were all clustered under that one geranium leaf, and they were slow, not flying, just sunbathing in the light shining through the leaf. I had a few other geraniums near that window, and this one is all that's left after 4 weeks of treatment. When I started learning about behavior of different species, I figured that what I saw was likely the greenhouse thrips because their behavior of this species fits the symptoms I was observing. The damage they cause occurs mainly on the underside of leaves. Greenhouse thrips is sluggish and the adults tend not to fly. Individuals feed in groups, and populations usually begin in a limited part of the plant and spread slowly. When I first found the thrips on this plant, on that one leaf on the underside, I trimmed off all the damaged leaves and I pruned it quite heavily. So this is the main stem with the new growth appearing after the treatment or since the treatment. If the underside of leaves on susceptible plants are regularly inspected to allow early detection and removal of new infestations, pruning off colonies can be effective. So I'm hoping this plant will be bouncing back and will be healthy from this point on. When I first found the adult thrips on the geranium, I started watching the African violets more closely, zooming in with my camera, and soon saw that the white specks on the leaves began turning into thrips larvae feeding on the leaves. On African violets, I saw that they were feeding not only on the underside of the leaves, but also on the top surface of the leaves. And here they are in action, thrips larvae having a picnic on my African violets. The video that you're about to see is shot with triple zoom and the photos with the 5x zoom. So now I have to warn you, this is not going to be pretty, but knowledge is power. Additional symptoms immediately visible to human eye are the signs of damage resulting from thrips feeding on the plant tissue, both blooms and foliage. So it's not only the blooms, spill pollen that you can see, but you can also see the damage to the leaves. Thrips feed by puncturing the epidermal or the outer layer of plant tissue and sucking out the cell contents, causing the damage. These African violets were grown in the same area at the kitchen sink window. As I mentioned earlier, I got rid of most of the affected plants and only kept these few for the video so we can inspect the damage caused by thrips up close. I had since removed the blooms on all affected plants, but we can see the damage on leaves. On foliage, we can see feeding scars, distorted growth. These are the signs of plant tissue damage resulting from the thrips larvae feeding on leaves. Here we see the scars, and here. And then if you look under the leaves, and that's why it's so important to look under the leaves. Let me see. Yeah, the younger leaves had been, all the plants have been treated, so the younger leaves no longer have the signs. But if we look under the older leaves, you will see the scarring here, and this one has here, you see, that is how heavy the damage was to this plant, and this was from the larvae feeding on the leaves. And then you will see that the leaves are drying and just dying out completely. And then the same we can see on this plant. And this particular foliage still have dead thrips larvae, believe it or not. I will include a zoom right now so you can see the dead larvae still here on this leaf. That's why I'm wearing gloves as a precaution. And here we can see more damage on this particular leaf here that is about to die out. Now I've sprayed these 4 weeks consecutively, so hopefully they're no longer alive here. Either the larvae or the eggs that were laid here that were about to hatch into larvae, and the pupae and the pre-pupae hopefully are gone as well. But this is why it is important to check on the bottom, on the reverse side of the leaves, on the underside surface. Here you can see how heavily this plant was damaged. Thrips feeding is usually accompanied by black varnish-like flecks of excrement. And I don't know if we can see it on this plant after the treatments, but I'll show you the zoom photos where you can see those black specks. Thrips infestations can also be detected by the damage to the blooms. Spilled pollen on open blooms, although as I mentioned previously, I didn't see it on mine, but it just depends on the species of the thrips that infected the plants. In the western flower thrips, that's another species commonly known, they might first affect the blooms, and flower buds may deform and fail to open, in addition to the spilled pollen. Left untreated plants infested by thrips tend to decline overall. You can see the dried up blooms, dying leaves, and then the plants will, if left untreated, they will just eventually die. The plants that you saw on the previous video had been all discarded, and I no longer have them because they were having too much damage already from the thrips larvae feeding on the foliage. In the next episode, I will show how I treated my plants to get rid of thrips and what I'm planning to do to keep my collection thrips free. Stay tuned.